Hey everybody, welcome back to DejaVue.
It's your favorite Vue podcast. You just don't know it yet.
Indeed, and you hear, maybe you see the person, the voice. He is back. Welcome back, Michael Thiessen. How are you doing, Michael?
I'm doing great. Thanks. It's great to be back.
Lovely to have you here after your paternity leave and break. It's so nice to have another episode and the two of us straight away again. Lovely.
Yeah. For those of you who don't know who I am Michael Thiessen. I do full-time Vue education and courses and newsletters and all up on Twitter or X or whatever you like to call it these days. Yeah, I'm here with Alex as usual.
Hey, yes, exactly. And I'm also doing content in the Vue and Nuxt ecosystem. I have a YouTube channel. I'm part of the Nuxt team as well. And by day, I'm a web engineering consultant helping companies with Vue and Nuxt.js. And of course, all links are in the show notes. So if you have questions, if you want to see what you're doing, if you want to subscribe and follow also the podcast, it's all in there.
And you may have seen me a couple episodes ago in the Vue.js Amsterdam recap episode. So we kind of got our chronological episode like ordering out of whack, but we recorded that one right after the conference. So I was, still around then. And so if you're wondering what was going on, that's what happened there.
Exactly. I mean, now that the replays are out, the videos are there, we thought, yeah, let's release it together with the talks and go a little bit out of order. But I think that was pretty fitting. And yeah, here we are.
Today, we are going to be talking about design patterns, specifically in Vue. So design patterns, probably everyone has a slightly different definition of what they would consider a pattern, but design patterns are basically different ways of solving problems, common problems that come up again and again in different applications. So, for example, how do we get state from one part of your application to another part of your app? Everyone has to deal with this in different ways, and it's different for every application. So we can't have we can't create a library to solve this problem. We can't solve it specifically with code, but we can have these ideas, these common approaches or ways of thinking about this problem that can help us find that good solution over and over again without having to, constantly reinvent the wheel time and time again.
So it's basically some kind of approach or like mental model on how to solve specific problems when you don't use an algorithm for, but like how, as I said, how do I do state with A to B, or how do I set up my composable in a nice way? Like how do I make sure the business logic somehow is filled into the components and reactivity is there and all that?
Yeah, a mental model is a perfect way of describing it. Like an algorithm for your brain, basically something like that. Yeah.
Sweet. Okay. And I mean, you know quite some of these design patterns in Vue.js. I mean, you made a whole course about it.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time putting together and thinking about these different patterns and not just patterns as they apply to software development, but how we can use them specifically in Vue and how they end up working in our Vue apps and how they apply to components and composables and all of that sort of stuff. And so a couple months ago, I released the Clean Components Toolkit, which is a set of 18 different patterns and ideas like this. And probably around now, maybe soonish, I will be putting out an update for that with a few more tools in there as well.
Sweet. I mean, as someone who bought the course back in the day, it's like November. I'm looking forward to the update.
Yeah, some extra stuff for you.
Yes, and for everyone else as well. So if you're interested, of course, check the show notes. There is a link straight away there. And the design patterns we'll discuss in a second. They are also mentioned in the course with like a near real world example and like how to refactor things, like the whole bundle, let's say.
Yeah, so let's just get right into it. So the first one that I want to talk to you about is thin composables.
Interesting name. Okay.
Yeah, so hopefully the name gives you a bit of an idea of what it might be. The basic idea here is that instead of putting everything into one big composable and having all of your logic and all of the code in one spot like that, we actually create your composable as a thin layer of reactivity. And we take all of the other business logic that's in that composable, and we push it out into a plain JavaScript or TypeScript file. And so in that way, we separate it into these two pieces. We have your plain JavaScript that has your business logic and can be ported around between different frameworks or different applications. You can use it on your backend. You can do whatever you want with it. And then we have this composable that uses those functions, those business logic pieces, and then just applies your watchers, your computed refs, whatever else you need to do to make it reactive and fit within your Vue app.
Interesting. So why, like, I think it seems like a reasonable pattern so far. Saying, okay, business logic, one function, a composable using that in a way. But when would you say should people apply this pattern? Like all the time they use composables, or is there like a good way to distinguish between when should the composable be thin versus when it's okay to have like a thick composable, I guess?
Yeah, so the when to use the pattern is always the hardest part because it's usually fairly easy to describe what it does. And then when to use it, it always requires some sort of judgment and experience. And so I'm not going to say, oh, it depends, because that's a useless answer. And
Yeah.
I hate giving that answer. But it does depend. And but generally, I would say as your composables grow, you might want to do this just to like organize it better and split things up. But also, I think it makes it easier to reason about your code. If you've got some complex logic going on, you can think about the business logic separately without having to worry about, okay, how does this reactive piece update? Why isn't it updating? What's going on here? Why isn't this ref value changing when I think it should be? You can think about those things separately, and you don't have to be working through your business logic problems at the same time.
I see. So you would say if the composable also grows, then it's a good indicator to say like, yeah, the bigger it gets, the more likely it's good to extract something, especially if it's not about reactivity into like an own business logic focused function or file and so on.
Yeah.
Sweet. And I can also like, now that you say that, I can also imagine another benefit, because that straight away comes to my mind, the testing part, right? Like if I imagine testing like Vue component specific things works, but I think the people who ever written a unit test and every now and then do so, right? The people maybe not in touch that much, they might be more comfortable testing a typical like JS or TS function and not necessarily a composable, even though it's not more difficult. I mean, depending on what it's doing, but to have your business logic in the right tracks, then only having that encapsulated and being able to test it and say, okay, logic is fine, maybe it's just an integration problem, that can also help, right?
Exactly. The testing piece makes it easier as well, because again, you're only thinking about how the JavaScript or TypeScript part works. You're not having to think about the reactivity and all of that at the same time. And you can just focus on just regular plain old JavaScript and in your tests, and it can make it simpler.
Very nice. Now, another thing I was wondering, which also came to my mind, is would you then co-locate the composable and the business function, or would you like split them up in different files?
Yeah, I think I'd probably co-locate it, unless you're planning to use that business logic elsewhere as well. So I've had at least one use case where I had a business logic, like a method, a utility method that I wanted to use both on the server side and the client side. And it wasn't really like something that made sense to have as a API endpoint that both pieces could use. And so I really needed that method in both places. And so then if you have a use case like that, then it makes sense to put that maybe somewhere else in like a shared folder or however you want to structure that.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. And as you said, like if you need it in different projects, then you can like build an npm package out of that, or
Yeah,
a
exactly.
library, or like a Nuxt layer if using Nuxt, and so on and so on.
And if you have to migrate to React or whatever, you
Hopefully
can
not.
you can do that fairly easily because you're not tied into that reactivity. But yeah, hopefully you don't need to do that. But it's always good to plan for that worst case for, reducing that extra overhead in the future.
Yeah, also like as you said, being independent of the framework at least, or to separate nicely, also helps with the mental model once again to say that we don't have to focus on Vue's reactivity system. I mean, same applies for other frameworks too. If there are people saying, oh yeah, I use Angular, Svelte, or React, I don't need to focus on the parts that the framework does. It's plain and simple. It's a function I understand, and it can be not only tested but also read without any knowledge of the framework.
Yeah.
Yeah, really good point. I like that. I also have done that quite often in the past without like having a name for it. It's more like, okay, this feels big. I want to test it. I want to use it. And especially even because you can't use composables in every context, right? So like say in a form submit, you don't want to like call a composable. It feels at some point, at least for me, like natural to have an option to call that in a Vue or Next context or without that.
Yeah.
Very nice. And I think that was one of the easier patterns, but one definitely worth learning and applying. So yeah, what's on to the next one?
So the next one we're going to talk about is the data store pattern. So we'll circle back to this in just a moment, but this is very familiar to those of you who have used Pina before, because this is exactly how Pina works. But we can actually use this pattern without using Pina. So the idea here is that if you need to share state across your app, you don't want to just rely on passing props around, because then you end up basically having your props or all your state really high up this component tree, and probably a lot of it ends up in your root app component, and you're passing it through props down the component tree, and it gets to be a huge mess. So instead we have Vuex, which we had in Vue 2, and now we are using Pina for lots of state management stuff. And the idea behind those is basically we're going to have some global state. And so this is what the data store pattern solves for us, is that we stick some state inside of a composable, and then we can use that composable in any component that we need to have access to that state. And so we can also co-locate different business logic within that. So we can have state and then the different logic that uses that state all in the same composable, wrapped up neatly. And yeah, it makes a big difference.
I see. But so as you said, the data store, the first thing, of course, like terms like Pina or Vuex like ring the bell. You say it's pretty similar to how Pina itself like works from a mental model here once again. But what would be the difference between, let's say, Pina and like a self-built data store or composable?
So basically, Pina has a bunch of extra stuff added on to make it easier to use, and some like developer experience improvements. So the biggest one for me would be the protection against cross. What's the word? I always forget the exact name of it. But basically, you can get your state polluted on the server. If you're using server-side rendering with Nuxt, for example, then if you have global state on your server, well, that state is global across the whole server. And so if you have multiple requests come in at the same time, you can end up leaking state between those two requests. And that's not a good thing. And so Pina has specific protection against that, which is really nice. If you're using Nuxt, you get that with use state. That's the point of that, is to help solve that problem, among other things. And Pina also has some integration with DevTools and some other things like that. So if you took this data store pattern and then you said, oh, well, I'm using this on SSR, so I need to add this protection. And oh, I want to add DevTools integration, so I'm going to do this. And oh, maybe I want to make it easier to test this, so I'm going to add this. Eventually, if you kept going, you would just end up reinventing Pina. And so that's you have both ends of the spectrum. You have Pina is like the full powered version, and the data store is just, you can write a simple composable in 5 lines of code. And if you need extra flexibility, you don't like the way Pina works for some reason, you can re-implement your own like light version of it in this way.
Interesting. Yeah. As you mentioned, like this was also one of the things that come to my mind, like this cross requests, state pollution, something like that along the lines. with it's a classic problem, as you said. Use state and Nuxt would solve that, and Pina also solves that. But then if you say, okay, you can use it as a lightweight version, you can opt in for Pina to like avoid reinventing the wheel. What would you say is the benefit of having the data store pattern yourself and not just straight away say run and implement Pina instead?
My first answer would be I find it useful to know how it works and to have this better mental model of what Pina is actually doing. Even if you're just going to stick with Pina and you're not going to do your own thing, I think it is really helpful to know, okay, this is actually what it's doing. It's encapsulating state in this way, and it's doing all this other stuff. Oh, I understand how it works. It's the same reason why we sometimes like to deconstruct things or rebuild our own version of Vue, or let me try and see how this reactivity system works with proxies, and like, trying to build up that stuff so we can just understand it more deeply. The second reason is that there are some instances where you don't want to use Pina. And so this is a more difficult question to answer. I was actually, I talked to Eduardo about this at VueConf Toronto a few months ago, and he was saying there are some places where you don't want to use Pina. And I kept pushing him for an example, but he could not come up with one like on the spot. It's a tricky problem. And so I don't have like a hard use case for that, but yeah. And I've seen him say on Twitter before, like, when should you use Pina? Well, try and avoid using Pina. And I think that's one thing I like about him is he's not vain and trying to be like, use my thing, use the thing I made. He's just like, you know what? If it helps you, use it. But like, if there's a simpler way, use the simpler way.
Yeah, exactly. It's not about like ideology saying, okay, I built this, everybody has to use it. I generally, I think this is a thing that's common in the Vue ecosystem as well. Like, hey, there's a cool tool. If you have a problem that this tool solves, use it. And otherwise don't, because it's complexity, it's additional JavaScript, and so on and so on. And I like that. I also think like Pina, I've built quite some software where Pina comes in handy. But I also like the data store pattern when building composables in Nuxt, especially if you have a simple like, I don't know, use user with like, okay, some authentication, some things, because of the fine-grained control through use state, what is hydrating, what is happening when, how to set things. And also then with using use fetch or use async data, which you shouldn't use in a Pina store, it's something that is sometimes really confusing people, but it's more about documentation. So we'll get onto that at some point. It's also why I commonly say like, okay, yeah, if you need Pina, go for it. But it's also a good way to just build yourself and then see how global state works, where you shouldn't do it in that way with SSR and so on. So totally agree.
One specific thing that I remember Eduardo mentioning to me is that like the difference is that Pina will return a reactive object, whereas with this data store pattern, you can have it return just a plain object if you want, or, anything, because it's your own function. You can return whatever you want. And so that's one specific way that you could change things up and have it be more flexible.
Yeah, fair point. And then you are the master of your own like fine-grained reactivity. Yes. You don't have like everything is reactive, and you can say, okay, here we go, some refs, all nice. I don't have to call store to refs. I know the user is a read-only ref, and it's fine. And read-only may be another good point where in Pina you shouldn't declare state as read-only because of like dev tools will break and so on and so on. While with your things you can do that. Sweet. So two patterns down the line. Also two I already knew, which is great. But I also like the naming. Like thin composables, like okay, everybody thinks of like the tiny thing. Also data store, it's something everybody like has at least some image on, like some image in your mind. And the next one we'll talk about is called preserve whole object. Now I'm curious.
Yeah, so I get this question a bunch. I've wondered this myself many times too. And so this is why I had to investigate it. And the question is it better to pass the entire object as a prop or to pass the properties of an object into a component? So if you had a user object and the user has a name, an email, and a profile image, should you pass that whole user object as one thing into your component, or should you split it up and pass those things individually? Pass in a name prop, pass in an email prop, and have that profile image prop. And the short answer is that we want to tend towards preserving that whole object. It's right there in the name, so that's kind of helpful to remember. And the reason for this is that typically with code, as it evolves and as you work on it and you add more features and you refactor it and all of that, components and code in general tends to use more of the things that you've passed into it and not less. So if you're passing in some parts of the user object into a component, probably in the future, you'll want more from that user object, not less. And so if you pass in these props individually, you end up needing to add in more and more props as time goes on. But if you have passed in that user object as a whole thing straight away, well, that component, you can add features that use more and more of that user object without actually modifying anything, because you're already passing that whole user object straight in.
I see. So it's really about more like, okay, you have to touch less lines to widen functionality of a component. If you say like, okay, I have these 10 other props I can use. Interesting. I see. That makes sense. But one question that came to my mind, and that's more of an edge case, but I think it's still important to mention, is what about components that, like say you pass a computed prop or something in there, and it's like let's say a big nested object, then the component will always like re-render when anything in that object will change, like also even deep low, because it's nested reactivity. Right. And let's say you have, I don't know, one example is it's always e-commerce. They have like a big a big shopping cart with like 300 items and super complex UI. Do you think in this case it would make sense to only pass the things needed to avoid that the components have to re-render and it might come to like performance issues? I think the whole like topic is a bit about like prop stability. I think it's called in the Vue docs or so.
Prop stability. I haven't heard that term. But yeah, I think, well, in terms of performance, I think it makes sense to, if you need to have a optimization there, then certainly go for it. And I think it sort of speaks to like this broader idea of, we don't want to be so focused on these patterns and, oh, I have to use this way. I've always got to use this. It's usually just like, this is a helpful thing that can point you in the right direction. But, you know, as with all advice, sometimes it's useful. Sometimes the exact opposite is useful. It just depends on your situation. And so I would say definitely in this case, if you have a bunch of performance issues with passing in the whole object, then that's, well, you should change it so that you are only passing in the props that you need. One other thing that comes to mind is, I remember working on some code where we received this giant object from the back end and we passed the whole object in. Well, actually, we didn't even pass the whole object in. For some reason, we ended up using a v-bind of this object onto a component. But the problem is this object had like 30 different props, was super deeply nested, but only like 4 or 5 of those were actual props on the component. So then when you went into the dev tools and you looked at what was being rendered to the DOM, all of these extra properties were being added as attributes on this element. And it was just like cluttering up the page and adding extra page weight. And it was just like, wait, what's going on here? So not exactly the same issue, but like a similar one where it's like, okay, maybe we need to be like careful that we're not just like, if we're just passing around the whole thing, we need to be careful that we're not including things we don't want to include.
Yeah, that's a good point. Also, like a bit of the con or the danger of using vbind, because if you add more to an object, you don't necessarily notice that these are just like attributes, because TypeScript won't complain, because maybe you want to pass these things as attributes to the HTML element tag. Why not? So yeah, that's a good point. And with regards to prop stability, I just checked the Vue documentation. They have like a little part on performance, of course, where they say, okay, let's say you have a list item component, and you render this for each item in the list. So you do have v4. And then you have two things to pass in. And once the item should get an ID, and the second thing it should get is the information if it's active or not. And the bad example would be to say, okay, we pass in the information if it's active or not. We pass in the ID of the active item, while in the more performant one is to move that calculation to a parent and say, okay, we pass in true or false depending on the ID. So like if the ID equals active. So instead of like changing all the properties in the list, so all the components to re-render, because the prop would change if you click on another item, it will only change for the one was selected before and the new one.
Right. So it's be thoughtful about what props actually get passed. So you're not constantly changing them and getting that performance hit. Yeah.
But of course, it's, I think a lot of things as usual, if you have like 10 items, it probably doesn't matter much. But as soon as you say, okay, there is something reacting very slowly, or there is like an actual problem on low-end devices, it's worth to benchmark and to figure out what to do, and then find a solution, as with all the performance problems, let's say.
Yeah, and even with design patterns like this, if you have a really small app, you can get away with not thinking about the structure of your app really, because you don't need organization. But as it gets bigger and bigger, you have to be more and more thoughtful and intentional, and like that organization and how you structure things and what patterns you use and what you don't use really makes a big difference as the complexity and size of things grows.
Also like consistency, if you say at some point you want to onboard someone else, same idea.
Yeah, saying, oh, we always pass the whole object. That's like, maybe there's no lint rule for it exactly, but having that as like this is our
guideline.
Yeah, and like you catch it in your code reviews and whatever else. Like that's, I think that makes a big difference too.
Wonderful. Yeah. And I also think it's always a trade-off, as we have it everywhere, versus like code readability versus performance. Like that's why we don't write like for loops, because we don't care about these 1 millisecond or a 0 point something of like million operations. It doesn't matter. And if it does, then you will write that for loop, but commonly it doesn't.
So we've covered 3 different patterns this episode, and that's all we've got time for today. If you like this and want to hear more patterns, just let us know. Comment on wherever you're watching this or listening to this on X. You can let us know. And if you want to dive in deeper and see actual examples of this with like refactoring steps and step-by-step examples worked out on how this applies to real world code, I have a course on this called Clean Components Toolkit. As I mentioned earlier, it's by the time this episode drops, there should be an update coming out or shortly thereafter. So we'll be going from 18 to 21 different patterns. So 3 patterns that we showed today are included in that, and a bunch more.
So 18 more to learn and 3 more to dive deeper into with realistic examples. Very nice. Michael, like I'm asking you now, do you have a discount for our listeners, for the loyal DejaVue community here? Can you give us something?
I'll see what I can do. If I do have a discount, I'll put it in the show notes in the description, and we'll get you that.
Perfect. Then check out right there down below for the link with a discount. And then that's it for today. I think a very concise episode about some design patterns in Vue.js that you should know. Also, as Michael said, let us know if you want to hear more, if you want to apply them, if you've applied them already and just didn't know the names of that, and which other things you want to see or hear about. Yeah, that's it for today. Thanks a lot for listening. Check out the other episodes if that's the first one you've listened, or the second one or the third. There are way more.
And if you enjoyed these patterns, make sure to share with a coworker or friend. Maybe they'll learn from it as well.
Exactly. And then you will see or listen or hear us next week again. And stay tuned for further episodes.